Okay, so it's 8:30 now. We will be starting, but let me just do some technical reminders. So before we get started, a few Zoom logistics. Today's event will run for an hour, and we will be recording this session, and we will be sending out an email after the event with a link to the recording. Kindly use the chat throughout the event to post comments and questions. Also, may we request for everyone to introduce yourselves in the chat. You can type in your name, your organization if you belong to any, and where you are tuning in from so that we will know uh, what is the reach of our webinar for today or tonight. Uh, okay, so we now have somewhere around 22 people in the room. And let me just start with hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jay De Jesus. I am currently the Asia organizer for World Beyond War. For those who don't know us yet, we are a global nonviolent movement that aims to abolish the institution of war while promoting a system of peace. Our series of webinars, starting with Myanmar in February, aims to create more spaces for people to share their experiences in local contexts and continue these conversations so we can find commonalities and intersections on our peace advocacy and to voice out our calls for peace together. Today's webinar will focus on the historical context that led to the current situation, what the actors, mainly like different governments, did, and how it affected the lives of the people. As we did with our first installment of this webinar series, so we will be having more. We want to show that our bias as we continue our peace building work is to ensure that people's rights and welfare should be at the helm of policy creations and government agreements to ensure that their actions will be for the benefit of everyone. Like when we ask them to declare neutrality in times of aggression or to join us in calling for the end of wars, militarism, and the installation of a peace system. So, are you ready, everyone? Can we have like a virtual clap or a virtual heart before we introduce our speaker for tonight? Are we all alive here? Are we energized? So, without any further ado, let me introduce our speaker for today's webinar. Our speaker, Brian Hioe, is one of the founders of New Bloom magazine. And Brian is a writer, an editor, a translator, an activist, and a DJ based in Taipei. In 2014, he was one of the founders of New Bloom magazine, an online magazine covering activism and youth politics in Taiwan and the Asia Pacific that was founded after the Sunflower Movement, which he was a participant in as a student activist. In his capacity as such, he helps run the community space for events that New Bloom runs in Taipei called DAYBREAK. So everyone, I request to give virtual hearts or virtual clap to our speaker, Brian. Brian?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity to talk. And so we can talk about the situation in Taiwan today. I'll talk a bit about the history, the current situation, and then what is the situation with regards to, for example, US and China, which we're caught between uncomfortably. So I'm going to share my screen because I do have a presentation. You can see it, everybody? Okay, perfect. So I'll talk a bit about Taiwan's complicated political history then. And so I'll start with some of the recent events to highlight, for example, what has occurred. Because I think particularly for many of us that are not from the region, we're familiar with, for example, US militarism, but less than with China, which claims Taiwan as part of its own and military threatens it. And so as an activist, I came out of the Sunflower Movement in 2014. More recently, there was a similar movement called the Bluebird Movement, which I'll talk about in a bit. But it was seen at the time as representing the kind of views of Taiwanese young people about what we think for our future, because Taiwan is a formerly authoritarian country that was democratized. It fits the very classic example of a country that was backed by the US for decades in the interest of anti-communism, which I'll get into. But now it's a very different place. And so what has happened recently, for example? So Taiwan, that we do have very strong links with our neighbor, and there is, for example, cases of Taiwanese activists when they travel to China and then disappear. One of the most famous cases is an activist called Li Mingzhe, who was chatting with with friends from China who were curious about Taiwan's democratization, and then fell afoul of state security, and then was imprisoned for 5 years. He's currently back and is very active, but the number of Taiwanese missing in China has increased in past years, and that's a sign. So I myself, for example, wouldn't travel to China because would I come out? I'm not too sure. And then domestically, we have a very contentious politics about this issue of our relation to China, which I'll also explain in a bit, and that is rooted in this history. But then, for example, we also do have actors running around in Taiwan, such as pro-China gangsters who at times attack students. And these are groups that usually have a link to gangs that during the authoritarian period were conducting political killings for the US-backed KMT. And so, yeah, here's a bit more about that activist. And he's one of the more prominent examples when this has taken place. But then I think for activists such as myself, we are quite cautious because then looking in the region, we see, for example, what happened to Hong Kong in the past years. So this is a picture I took. I was in Hong Kong in 2019 and saw the protests, saw a generation of young people up against the Hong Kong government, which was cracking down on this demand for democracy, for continuing to maintain political freedoms. That was very dramatic. I saw many young people who were incredibly young. I mean, for example, high schoolers. And again, these are all photos I took when I was there. And then the police respond with overwhelming force to that. And so when we look at the region, this is the backdrop for understanding, let's say, why Taiwan has frictions with China. We see what has happened there and maybe don't want it for ourselves to occur. And so, in that sense, Taiwan is de facto independent, but it does not have de jure sovereignty in the sense that it is default. It is in existence as a independent country with its own borders and government and economy. But by the international recognition, the PRC, that is, say, our neighbor across the strait, is recognized. And there's this contentious history about, well, does China claim Taiwan? And so, who are Taiwanese in that sense? And when we talk about Taiwanese, I think people often think most of who are, in fact, Han settlers. So, like myself, Taiwan has around 400 years of Han settlement, but the earliest inhabitants are indigenous. And interesting enough, how did Han Chinese end up in Taiwan? It is as being migrant workers, in fact, for the Western powers that colonized Taiwan. So this was actually the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese. And so this is very similar to other countries in the region in that sense. And so an older name for Taiwan that's more commonly seen in the past is Formosa, which is a colonial name. And why were Han Chinese then traveling to Taiwan when the original inhabitants are indigenous? It is because of the fact that, well, when you come to Asia, you are trying to extract resources, and in this case, tea. Tea, for example, this word that we use is in fact Minanhua, like which is what we and the southern Chinese province that the majority of the Han Chinese ancestors come from, Fujian, speak. And so, yeah, there is this history of indigenous life in Taiwan that is not connected to the dynastic China. And I think this is very important. And so, oftentimes, we are undertaking a form of colonial erasure when we talk about Taiwan only in relation to China. And then, in terms of where the indigenous are from, they are connected to the Austronesian peoples of the Asia Pacific. And so, for example, there are many shared words. My dad, for example, who is Chinese Indonesian but immigrated to Taiwan, will watch indigenous television, and his main language is Bahasa, and he'll understand some words actually because there are some kind of shared elements. And so then what happened? For the Ming and the Qing, Taiwan was considered part of it, but not terribly important. Sometimes not really considered part of it. It was either way a frontier, a hinterland. Indigenous were, for example, not necessarily thought of as even human beings or as belonging to the dynastic Chinese Empire, but even as human-shaped animals who were then hunted for uh, Chinese medicine, traditional Chinese medicine. So it's very important to remember this. And then after the what we consider more the modern era, Taiwan is given to the Japanese after the Sino-Japanese War, but then did Taiwan been potentially Chinese? It's debatable because the majority of the population today is Han Chinese, but many are from the prior waves of migration to Taiwan in the past 400 years when Taiwan sometimes had a tenuous relationship to uh, the Chinese mainland. And as for indigenous, I mean, they have made their viewpoints clear in writing statements about that they are indigenous and they are the original sovereigns of the land. I think that is something that we need to acknowledge. So what happens in the course of Taiwan's Japanese colonial period? And so here's a photo of that. I'm not get into the too much detail of that, but that is a 50-year period, and that is the period of Taiwan's modernization. And so then a generation of Taiwanese grow up speaking Japanese, and that is the intellectual language. And so many of the early historical works researching Taiwanese history, for example, from this period, are written in Japanese. And if, let's say, you're an indigenous scholar of history, you also will learn Japanese to access, for example, the Japanese colonial records, which, as again, one of these legacies of colonialism is actually, of course, an important historical document. Uh, then, in that sense, we have Taiwan being passed on to the control of the KMT, what is known as the Chinese Nationalist Party, which I alluded to earlier. And that occurs after the end of, oh, sorry, there's a fire truck passing by. That occurs after the defeat of the Japanese in World War II. And so this is a case in which Taiwanese themselves were not allowed to decide, well, what do you want your future to be? In this arrangement of powers between the US and China, Russia, that's say the Soviet Union, these other Great Britain, these other great powers, Taiwan did not have a say. And so the KMT, the Chinese Nationalist Party, comes to Taiwan and enforces what is a decades-long authoritarian period. This is a period known as the White Terror, and it lasted for decades. There's not free and fair elections. What happened was the KMT ruled over in an authoritarian fashion. We had repression in the form of the White Terror with purging of leftists. This is very familiar in the region, of course. We do see this. This is again the high tide of anti-leftism during the Cold War. There's the killing of Taiwanese intellectuals, of indigenous, and then there is the forbidding of speaking Taiwanese, Hokkien, which is the Chinese dialect, so to speak, or actually itself its own language. It's not fair to say dialect as though it's subordinate to Chinese. There are many Chinese languages, uh, or indigenous languages, or Hakka, which is another minority language. I'm actually Hakka, are suppressed, and this is in favor of having this Mandarin hegemony. And so that leads to, for example, you go everywhere, you see statues of Chiang Kai-shek, who is the typical example of a strong man who is propped up by, again, the US in the interest of anti-communism. He was defeated by Chiang Kai-shek. Sorry, Chiang Kai-shek was defeated by Mao in the Chinese Civil War. And then here you see him with General MacArthur. And so Taiwan, then, its history is in many ways determined by the legacy of the Cold War in terms of how domestic politics occurred, that there was not elections, that there was killings and purges, but then also in terms of being traded off as a chess piece. Because for the US now, then, is convenient to prop Chiang Kai-shek up as free China, quote unquote. And then for people in Taiwan who, until just previously, had been part of the Japanese Empire, suddenly there's this attempt at re-Sinization, but seen as kind of culturally oppressive in that sense, saying that, well, you've always been Chinese. Sorry, if you speak Taiwanese Hokkien, you're going to be fined or punished. I've been to the areas of Taiwan in which you see the history very clearly. And for example, if a car drives by with a military personnel, that is, say, the KMT, and you don't salute them, then they will call you up and find you and punish you. It's very easy to track, especially students, because you're wearing uniforms, for example. And intellectuals, reading groups, leftist groups were all cracked down upon, and that just went on in what was once the longest martial law period in the world. It's only surpassed by Syria. And so this is also where you do have the eventual rise of democratization, because when you look at Taiwan today, it is elections. So this is from a recent election. This is the KMT, actually, the former authoritarian party. It's still around and alive in Taiwanese politics today and has interestingly reinvented itself as a pro-unification party. Because though this was the party that was backed by the US during the Cold War, uh, and then called for reconquering the Chinese mainland, as this became increasingly impossible as time went on, militarily impossible, as China's economy eventually overtook Taiwan's, and China's political reach is now, of course, international. The KMT decides to focus on unification at all costs. the desire to retake China and put it under KMT control, that fades away. Instead, what you have is a desire to unify, I think, out of a kind of cultural loyalty to China, a desire to just have return to the motherland. But the people who are descended from the KMT in Taiwan are only around 10% of the population, and that includes me. I mean, 3% of my, sorry, three of my grandparents were born in China. Only one was born in Taiwan. And then besides that, the other 90%, there's between 2 and 5% indigenous, depending on how you count. The usual count you see is 1 or 2%. But then, for example, many people are mixed race. And that is actually another issue where that's not so really legally recognized. In order to qualify for indigenous legal status, people from mixed marriages, or even from two different indigenous groups, that there are issues there in terms of this kind of colonial system of classification that has persisted. But then as for the KMT claiming that Taiwan has always been Chinese, obviously, yes, there were cultural links and there were Chinese empires that claimed Taiwan. But then it is actually also very interesting when you look at, for example, the writing of Mao Zedong in the 1930s. He says that Taiwan should become an independent country the way that South Korea, or Korea, sorry, Korea as a whole, should become. And so that is a interesting shift then in which after the KMT comes to Taiwan, then the claim eventually becomes that Taiwan has been part of China since time immemorial. I think a lot of that is connected during the Cold War to this striving over political legitimacy between the KMT, which is now in Taiwan and has changed the name of Taiwan or refers to it as the Republic of China, as having always been part of the Republic of China, or belonging to this modern version of China. And then if you are the People's Republic of China, then you have to kind of fight that claim. And so this is still what the KMT claims today. And I'll talk a bit about it, but then their recent political leader, the current chair, who's actually I've met twice, has gone and visited China, for example, multiple times, claiming that this will bring about peace. In the meantime, the other political party that is the major party, we do have mostly a two-party system, is the Democratic Progressive Party, which is a center-left party. They're often conservative on economic relations and has become very connected to the US in terms of the fact that the US probably prefers to see the DPP in power. It is a party that is comparatively more progressive. It legalized gay marriage. The last president, Tsai Ing-wen, made a apology to indigenous on behalf of the state, though she actually herself is part indigenous. And it's actually a kind of interesting shift in history, though, where a party that rose up during democratization, during a period of heavy repression against a US-backed dictatorship, has now become a party that is favored by the US, which is, of course, as we all know, is still in the region and does aim to broadly contain China. And in the meantime, the KMT as a political party is now rather pro-China in the sense of pro-Chinese state and saying that China is in fact more democratic than Taiwan. The economy is prospering. Our future lies with China, that we are historically always linked there, but we need to unify. And so in turn, you have this US skeptic rhetoric is the term used that has emerged to describe America. I mean, some of it is that, I mean, there's obviously great reasons to be critical of and skeptical of the US. But also, I'm pretty sure the US did not manufacture COVID-19 to destroy the world, as I'm also pretty sure China, the Chinese government, did not either. Uh, so it can be on the conspiratorial. But then whenever you do have Donald Trump making all these statements about Taiwan and openly referring to Taiwan as a chess piece, a geopolitical chess piece, in bargaining with China, again, as insofar as Taiwan is caught between what I view as two empires, China and the US, the KMT really leans into that skepticism. And my own view is that this is another one of the odd contradictions and paradoxes of Taiwanese history, in which a party that fought against a US-backed dictatorship is now backed by the US, and the party that was the US-backed dictatorship is now backed by China or seeks China's endorsement. And my own understanding of this, which is my own view, from someone that comes from, in fact, a KMT family that was linked to the authoritarian regime. For example, my grandfather was literally one of Chiang Kai-shek's comrades, personal acquaintance that came to Taiwan with him, is that the KMT, when they were in Taiwan, constituted a settler colonial ruling elite. And you are able to maintain your set of privileges above the 90% of the rest of people because you're being backed by the US. The US often does this, of course, to maintain clients in the interest of anti-communism or other geopolitical aims. And so if you have lost these privileges in the course of democratization and no longer are an elite class, what can you maybe do is maybe you switch your backer to now the CCP. And so that's my understanding of things. And so then, what are Taiwanese young people thinking and feeling? I alluded to that there have been movements about it that we keep our eyes on, for example, what has happened to Hong Kong. And so I'll get into a bit of that because this is also where, for example, my organization came from, and that's kind of the work we do. I think a lot of the Taiwanese organizations that you encounter of this generation are from the Sunflower Movement generation. And so this was a movement in 2014 that broke out against a trade agreement that the KMT, which had come back to power, because while Taiwan democratized, the KMT was never made to dissolve. It was allowed to stay around, or maybe allowed is not the word, because it guided the process of democratization in order to stay around and not be dissolved, setting up the rules of elections, for example, that continue to actually be competitive and is still a competitive party today in Taiwan, in part because of gerrymandering, in part because of clientelism. You do have long-standing patronage networks for the KMT, for example, especially in rural areas in which you do have vote buying and corruption and threats against people that vote non-KMT historically. And that has faded, but the KMT is still around and alive electorally today. And that in the course of democratization, that is why the former authoritarian party is still around. And that's why it could come back to power from 2008 to 2016. And so the Sunflower Movement broke out in 2014 when the KMT-controlled legislature rammed a trade agreement through that would have allowed Chinese companies to invest in the service sector industry. That's 65% of the GDP. And so then there were a lot of fears that this would lead to self-censoring, to this kind of uh, domestic political repression because of economic means, in fact. We have to remember also that, for example, free trade agreements, that's something the US has maintained global power using, establishing free trade agreements, using this kind of era of neoliberal trade, but also globalization in that. And I think at the time then it was understood as China trying to step into those shoes of the US, adopting similar means, building parallel institutions to counter US power, but also in many ways modeled after it. I mean, I think you see that across the board. For example, in Xinjiang, when you do have Muslims being arrested and put into re-education camps, quote unquote, the discourse, which you'll see in Chinese state media, is actually US anti-terrorism discourse, that we're fighting terrorism. And so then this movement broke out. It was lasted about a month, but it proved to be a very epochal moment in, I think, Chinese politics because many young people like myself stormed the legislature and occupied and fought the police. Here you can see me. I'm actually the person on the very right here. I found this in a YouTube video of this clash with the police. And so it made it very clear, I think, that young people in Taiwan today, I think the majority just do not identify as Taiwanese because even if as Chinese, because even if you're like myself, where three of my grandparents are from China and were born there, I don't have the direct experience of China that my grandparents did, nor the nostalgia that my parents did. And so then that has reflected in very different views. And you look at polling across the board from various academic institutions, and you see that Taiwanese identity is consistently on the rise, Chinese identity is on the decline, but also identifying as both Taiwanese and Chinese is also on the decline. But in the meantime, that correlates to supporting the status quo, that is, say, Taiwan's current de facto independence, in which Taiwan may not be recognized legally, but it's true that, again, we are de facto separate from China. It's not that the PRC can arrest me tomorrow because they don't have jurisdiction over Taiwan. Then we'll see if that changes if there's a invasion or something like that in the next few years. And so people don't want war because people don't want to declare independence in the way that China will use as a pretext to attack. But then you look at the polling is also that people identify as Taiwanese and not Chinese. And so it kind of comes together in this way. And so that was the Sunflower Movement. It eventually led to a change in government where the DPP, the center-left party that emerged from the pro-democracy movement and is more assertive on Taiwanese identity, took power again. It had previously held power from 2000 to 2008, but then lost power. And so now it came back to power. It has ruled for 10 years, holding the presidency. But importantly, in the course of Taiwan's entire history, there's only been one period in time in which the KMT, as a political party, did not control the majority in the legislature. And that was 2016 to 24, so until very recently. And so in the course of Taiwan's democratization, there's a lot of, I think, often description of presidential elections as marking, for example, transition from to democracy. But that's in quite limited because if the legislature has always been controlled by the KMT, they can limit what the president does. And so there's only ever been this period that a non-KMT party held a majority in the legislature. And so it shows how democratization is in fact still an ongoing process. And I think many of us from the region are familiar with the kind of patterns of authoritarian nostalgia that have emerged. Philippines is one example with Marcos Jr. In South Korea, I mean, the last president tried to have a coup. The conservative president before him was the daughter of the former dictator. Uh, in Japan, the LDP, the right-wing party, has ruled unchallenged since World War II, effectively a one-party state, even if elections do happen. Indonesia, you see the rise of Prabowo, who is someone who is a general in the past authoritarian regime. And so that has something that is also present to some extent in Taiwan, but has not really taken root. To be sure, the great-grandson or self-proclaimed great-grandson of Chiang Kai-shek, the dictator, is the mayor of Taipei, and probably will run for president in the future. But it has not taken root, I think, in the way that many other contexts in the region it has, because of the fact that I think there's this kind of identity issue, because young people in Taiwan identify as Taiwanese. We don't want to vote for this party that identifies as Chinese and is fine forcing all of us to as well, or that is the perception anyhow. And so then after Sunfire Movement, you have these various civic groups emerged, including the organization I started. There's attempts at creating progressive third parties, which unfortunately have gone nowhere and sometimes exploded dramatically, as I think leftist groups often are prone to doing. There's possibility of further unity among the progressive third parties in the future, or it's possible there are further splits. And it's also clear that some have moved into the right in an age of rising securitization. And so then that takes us to this kind of present moment of tensions. And I think it points to this return of history in the Cold War sense, insofar as now there are two, again, great powers that are allies with each other, and many of the countries in the region are just caught in between. And so I don't know if you've seen this cover before. It's from The Economist a few years back, and it termed Taiwan the most dangerous place on Earth because it is the place where World War II, III could happen if the US and China come to blows. And I'll get that into that next. So there has been rising tension in past years, and there's been a lot more focus on Taiwan because this is quite interesting. During the time of the Sunflower Movement, for example, you had articles being written by these Western commentators that like to talk about non-Western contexts as just chess pieces, that it's time to say goodbye to Taiwan, that it should just be given to China, and well, we don't care anymore. And if this goes away, then we're all the safer for it. And this continues this long-term history in which Western powers have just treated Taiwan, mostly America, as a chess piece to be traded off. There's no consultation with the wishes of its people or any care about what Taiwanese people say. Then at other points, it will be used as a way to counter China. And then China in turn has its own ambitions on Taiwan, of course. And so that has happened again recently. The Pelosi visit in August 2022 was a very pivotal moment. Uh, since then, my life has been way, way, way more busy. The week that Pelosi came here was the most busy I've been in my life because then I've been contacted by all these media outlets wanting to hear what people in Taiwan say. And what they want to hear is that people are freaking out and screaming in the streets because we're so afraid of an imminent invasion. And so it's true, though. We do actually have oh, why is it not working? Threats have increased. We have Chinese incursions into Taiwan's airspace on a daily basis, what's called the Air Defense Identification Zone. That doesn't mean territory. It means the space of air in which you say who you are, so people know who you are, and it's not a kind of perceived as a threat, and increased drilling. And so now at this point, China conducts two large-scale military exercises at least every year. And we're going to probably have another series of drills, I think, in the next few months, because usually there's one in the springtime in April, and then one in the fall. And we're already like close to June. The last set of exercises was also by China, which took place over the New Year, because I think a year cannot end without military exercises. I was very unhappy because I work as a journalist, and then suddenly on the New Year I have to work and report on all this stuff happening, which is stories I don't like to write about, things about militarization and security. And so this has increased. And part of it is because I think the US has put Taiwan more in focus. And the Trump administration, of course, is rather hawkish. And it continues this long-standing pattern, though, because during the Obama administration, now over a decade ago, we talked about the Asia pivot, in which the US sought to return to Asia to contain the rise of China. It sort of never really happened. But then the US is still concerned about this. And this replicates the longer term history of the region. Taiwan, as I mentioned, it's a classic pattern of a right-wing dictatorship backed by the US under the KMT, but now it is a democracy after democratization. And in that sense, then, what was Taiwan for the US during the Cold War is part of the first island chains. I mean, you look at the different places in Asia Pacific that have military bases, like the Philippines or South Korea or Japan. And Taiwan also did have military bases until the 1970s. It's only after the breaking of relations with Taiwan's official name, the Republic of China, that's the name that the KMT regime used to refer to Taiwan, that then there were not military bases. And during those times, you did have the similar patterns of, let's say, violence by US servicemen, and there'd be pushback in the form of protests. And then when there's this breaking of ties and this leaving of bases, it's also interesting because that is then perceived at that point in time as the US abandoning Taiwan to China. Again, continuing this pattern of just treating Taiwan as a chess piece, which now we see today as well with Trump, for example, in his recent comments on Taiwan after meeting with Xi Jinping. But then there was immediately, for example, the American ambassador, I think he had his like people like broke the window of his car or something like that, and as he was driving around in a motorcade, and that occurred. But then it's a way in which Taiwan is part of this history that we see in the larger region with the first island chain. And Taiwan would have a very different fate that is maybe more similar to these other countries if those bases had remained. But then that puts us in the strange situation in which Taiwan's historical backer militarily was the US. And then in an era of rising ties with in rising threats from China, that has led to the strengthening of ties with the US. And so you do see much talk of arms sales and trying to buy drones and munitions from the US, from the DPP these days. And I think in terms of regional securitization, it is very interesting because I often participate in peace movement activities. And then when it comes to explaining Taiwan's situation, it's very different because in many countries, it is the right wing, the far right, that is driving securitization and militarization. I was in South Korea recently also to meet with activists. And then every weekend you have, for example, these pro-US and pro-former dictatorship right-wing people, supporters of the former president, screaming things at you. I was in a Palestine march that passed by one of these protests. They just start screaming USA at you, which is very strange, and waving US, South Korean, and Israeli flags at you. And then in Taiwan, it's not the right wing, but then the progressive left has actually been forced into this relation with the US. And I think there's actually historically been an uncriticality of the US as well that has existed in Taiwan, because though the KMT was backed by the US, when it came to the pro-democracy actors, uh, they also somehow viewed America in idealistic terms as a kind of bastion of democracy. Many people studied in the US, for example, and learned about the history that they were banned from learning in Taiwan there. And so it's a way in which Taiwan is part of, but also has, because of historical reversals and contradictions, gone in a very different way. And so what has happened in the last few years then? So we have another movement 2 years ago, the Bluebird movement, in which that is the Gen Z movement, I would say. The Sunfire movement 10 years ago was us millennials, but now, of course, 10 years has passed. And this is against the KMT having taken control again of the legislature, the return to the status quo, because again, it was only an 8-year period in which ever they did not control the legislature. And they drastically tried to slash the government budget by 1/3 as a way to sabotage the DPP. And then there's attempts to expand legislative powers, which is specifically the trigger of the Bluebird movement 2 years ago, in a fear that would have, it was fear that this kind of resurgent authoritarianism, that these new powers would have allowed for calling up individuals to be questioned by legislators, that it was circumvented judicial institutions in order to basically allow the KMT to target and pressure people who they don't like, whether you're a politician, whether you're an activist, you might be a businessman and they are forced to reveal your trade secrets, which KMT businessmen then can take advantage of, or that you're a member of the military, let's say, and you're forced to disclose secrets about Taiwan's defense. And the KMT, in the meantime, has become, as I mentioned, pro-unification, but also the KMT politicians will frequently travel to China and meet with Chinese government officials. The KMT chair recently, again, who I met twice, in fact, is someone that has traveled to China and claimed this to be peace, as though she's making this sacrifice to establish peace. But one notes that she's not an elected leader. She is a very controversial political leader, only elected by the KMT membership. And she has made controversy on numerous occasions For example, she has argued that Taiwan, if it gets too close to the US, will provoke China in the way that Ukraine provoked Russia through getting too close to NATO. This is kind of discourse, again, this US skepticism, which I think in many ways comes from very bad places because we should all be questioning of American imperial power, but then it's used to shoehorn this into a way that is not critical of China, saying again that China is our future, that China is the destiny of Taiwan, that there's a shared destiny between Taiwan and China, that's one family on both sides of the straits with a common future, and that says she hopes to be see Taiwanese proud to be Chinese one day, which I think for many young people is viewed as alarming. In the meantime, there's also a lack of apology about the past crimes of the KMT during the authoritarian period. And so that leads us to this very strange contradiction in which Taiwan is again, part of this larger tableau of history linked to US militarism, but then has, in terms of the government, become aligned with uh, the US in that sense. And I think for me as a leftist in particular, that is quite an uncomfortable position to be in. And yet there is also the very real threats that we do face from China in terms of that we do have these daily incursions into our airspace. The military threats continue. During the drills that occur, actually, these various regularized military threats, China claims to be able to blockade Taiwan. And that is, I think, the scenario that we fear in the future is that one day there might be a blockade or an invasion. And this would be incredibly disruptive to the region, just because not only the impact on the economy, but just the amount of loss of life and the impact on these very large economies of China and Taiwan. The repercussions in the region would lead to an economic downturn for all of us. Shipping routes be blocked. We talk a lot about the U.S. Their adventurism in attacking Iran and the impact on the global trade in terms of, for example, the let's say Thailand is a good example. Immediately there's oil rationing because just the impact was that large, and of course it affects the common people most of all. And this would occur in a war scenario. But then for us in Taiwan, how can we avoid that as we're uncomfortably caught between the two? While also managing to preserve our democracy and freedoms and this faith that we've long had of being a chess piece between great powers during the Cold War and today in what is sometimes termed the new Cold War. And so paths out are harder to explore than I think ever. But then it does, I think, depend on people's movements that are not apologists for any states. I do sometimes question when, for example, you have this framing that, oh, the US and China are increasingly militaristic, and so is Taiwan. I don't think that's the case when we're just caught here in between. Even if there are some actions of the current government I find questionable in terms of securitization or Taiwan's alignment with the US in that sense, and also questionable actors like Israel, then it is also the fact that I don't think we're seeking to provoke anybody. But then what happens is you do have particularly Western peace activists who start idealizing China, for example, saying that China is a peaceful power, that it's always been peaceful, unlike the US. And in fact, I think if you are in the region and you have gone through this decades of facing Chinese threats, which are very regularized, the reason why Taiwanese do not panic in the streets and freak out, as I think often Western media would like to hear or acts like it is because we're very used to these threats. It's gone on for decades. I mean, for my parents' lifetimes and my grandparents' lifetimes, we always faced thousands of Chinese missiles pointed at us. And then that is also not to excuse China in that sense. And so how can we arrive at building the people-to-people connections that are beyond states and allow for establishing peace? I think that's very hard, but I think particularly when you do encounter Chinese people that, young people especially, in these young activist movements that are able to see beyond just the US-China tensions and seek to build ties with, for example, peace activists in Okinawa or the Philippines or Korea, and in that sense, try to not really think of this in terms of states, but in terms of people. I think that's quite helpful. And then in terms of China, for example, the Chinese state, I think that is people like to say China is not the enemy. The Chinese people are not my enemy. I stand in solidarity with the Chinese workers, with the Chinese so-called ethnic minorities, the queer communities who are being clamped down on by the Chinese state and brutally arrested, who I'm proud to call comrades. But then in the meantime, you do have the people that cannot distinguish the Chinese state from these activists. And I think that is a very dangerous thing. And I think there should be that line should be very clear. And so then what would lead to peace in that sense? And I think that looking at, for example, just this map, you see there's so many actors then that are involved. There's the US, there's China, there's Japan, there's the Philippines, South Korea, etc. And then in terms of the region, we generally see the resurgence of right-wing governments that have links to past authoritarian regimes back to power in this age of increased tension between the US and China. That is the effect this is having in the region. And Taiwan has gone a slightly different path because I think of this identity issue, because of the fact that the KMT is a conservative party. And so the DPP rising up as the party of Taiwanese identity was more progressive in that sense. It was calling for change against the status quo, but then it is, in the meantime, in terms of its international relations or geopolitical relations, become in a position similar to these right-wing authoritarian actors that you see across the region. So how do we think beyond that and think in terms of building movements? And so I guess I'll close there and we can kind of talk about it more in the discussion. And if you ever want to contact me, this is my contact information. And I'll leave this up for a minute. So if you want to screenshot the contact information, I'll stop screen sharing. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. I think that was a very comprehensive discussion of the situation, and at least, of course, coming from the context of a very historical um, point of view, we were able to see how it led to what is the current context of Taiwan. I think we have some questions in the chat. We are now going to transition to our question and answer portion or the open forum. We invite everyone to send in your questions, your comments through chat, and we will be reading them. But before that, while still waiting, I kind of like have one question. I think it was I watched this news, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember it correctly, last night, that there was a suggestion from Trump during his closed door visit in Beijing that he will be joining forces with China and Russia to push back against the ICC. We know that the Trump administration actually imposed what's this like a punishment on some of the ICC judges. Do you have any comments on that? We'll I mean I think the Chinese ministry have declined that, and oh well, I can't recall the. I hope I'm remembering correctly the word, but it's some sort of decline, and the White House is actually not confirming the the supposedly proposal.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, for example, my organization, we're very involved in the pro-Palestine activism in Taiwan. And unfortunately, our government has gone a different way. There's one time, for example, I was in a press meeting with the foreign minister and I questioned him on that. And then he just talked about how great Israel is, how Israel is a supporter of Taiwan and it helps us with things like drones and all that. But I think this is also very interesting because people will look at China's rhetoric, where historically China has sometimes paid lip service to the idea of supporting Palestine and criticizing Israel. But then when it comes back to the actual substantive of it, nature of it, rather than some kind of symbolic gesture of support, China has very close ties with Israel. And so, for example, China is one of Israel's largest trading partners. China also has the same interest in drones and technology like that, but also, for example, Pegasus, the spyware, as well. That's used in the region. It's very interesting, actually. Even the Indonesian government, which is because Indonesia is a Muslim majority country, there's a lot of support for Palestine. I mean, they will still maintain ties with Israel because they like to use Pegasus against activists. And so China is similar in that sense, and has declined to really veto kind of strategic votes in the UN as well. And so I think it's important to call people to account because I think this is, again, we talk about states and not people and not states, but then states will always be incentivized to side with each other because they can provide each other military technology and equipment and things like that. Authoritarian regimes like that, including Israel, will cling together in that sense. And so I think that is my take on it, I guess.
Mhm. We have one question. I hope that I get to say the name correctly. Simri Gomery question is I heard that Nancy Pelosi's interest in Taiwan related to Taiwan's expertise in manufacturing semiconductors, which are electronic components essential to computers. And so economics are the reason why the US and China were so eager to quote, own, unquote, Taiwan. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I think this is something that's important to note actually, is that basically, for example, the US threatened to use nuclear bombs over Taiwan in the 1950s. This is well before Taiwan's dominance in the field of semiconductors, which is really the past decade or so. It's a way in which basically I think, can be a bit reductive in our understanding of why US empire operates in a certain way. That's all according to, for example, economic extraction. In this case, the question of Taiwan and why the US has been interested in it is geography. The first island chain is, I think we should actually use this framing more often. It's a buffer zone for the US, having these, disposable states that can protect it as a kind of natural barrier. But then also Taiwan has always been desired by empires pre-modern, including the Ming and the Qing, and also then the Japanese. Because of its geographic location, you can really project power if you control Taiwan. And that's the reason why I believe that China desires Taiwan, not because of semiconductors, and also the US, not because of semiconductors. It's the geography. But it's true that Taiwan is the current leader in semiconductor manufacturing, producing 65% of global supply and 90% of advanced chips in everything from your iPhone to your electric vehicle, etc. And the world woke up to this during COVID-19 when there were shortages. The Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing industry had tried to really keep a low profile for a very long time and to build up this very dominant landscape because of the fact this would perhaps incentivize the world in defending Taiwan because of then it becomes a crucial node in the economy, but didn't really want people to be aware of that so much until relatively recently now it's very exposed. But I think we have to remember that it's this fighting and clashing over Taiwan is way beyond that. And then when we talk about semiconductors, there's also a lot of erasure there because who's actually making these? It's migrant workers from Southeast Asia in Taiwanese factories. And so that's also important to note.
Mhm. Okay, thank you for that. Another question. So we have two more words coming, three. Uh, Let me read first the one from Georgia Kelly. A Canadian MP, Michael Chong, has recently visited PM Lai with the stated reasons for of protecting Taiwan's democracy against Chinese authoritarian control. This has provoked strong uh, negative response from our Chinese embassy and ambassador. Can you comment on how middle powers like Canada should encourage peace between Taiwan and mainland China?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. I think it is emphasizing then that Taiwan's a democracy and the will of the people should be respected, and that the status quo is what should endure because this is what the majority of Taiwanese people, including the current government, support. So then I think rather than going to framing that echoes China as the Chinese government specifically, as let's say Donald Trump has, I think this is important. I think actually it is those of us caught between the US and China that need to really align in order to have any kind of power against these two very powerful superpowers. And so I think that maintaining that perspective is important. In the past, we had a lot of, in the past decades during the Cold War, the non-alignment movement or third world solidarity, those discourses are very strong. And I think we're kind of lacking it today. Sometimes you do have the view from some that, well, if there's US empire, we should just throw in with Chinese empire, and then vice versa. And I think that's a challenge.
Mhm. From Chris folks, how do Taiwan stand with tariffs with the US?
So this is actually very interesting. And actually, I should have talked a bit more about semiconductors because uh, Donald Trump loves to say that Taiwan stole the US semiconductor industry and then has also put tariffs on Taiwan as another form of economic coercion and power. And said that, well, if you build more of your semiconductor factories in the US, then maybe we'll lift those tariffs. And again, as I mentioned, the semiconductor industry really got to this extent because of a lot of backing from the Taiwanese government in order to create dependency on Taiwan that would lead other countries to have economic ties to Taiwan that would then push them towards defending it. And so then Trump wants to get rid of that. And he then will say that Taiwan stole the US semiconductor manufacturing industry. And in turn, Taiwan's afraid of the US stealing Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing industry. Because now there are these billion-dollar fabs built in Arizona because the US has really pressured Taiwan that way. And the tariffs are used as another way to then pressure Taiwan.
Mhm. We have, oh, questions are coming in. Okay, so another question from Hiroaki Nakamichi for China. Could they make a choice either G2 leaders status to stop Russia's war against Ukraine, NATO, or Taiwan? What are effects of such Chinese choice to Taiwan, either good or bad?
Yeah, I mean,
Hmm.
that's a very good question. There's a op-ed in the Financial Times by Adam Tooze, which I found quite remarkable because it's very much a Western perspective on this, which is like China's a responsible adult in the room now. The US is becoming this horrible place. China's great. You can go there and you can have a free market company. And I was like, okay, that's not what I see. But yeah, I think particularly there will be, as we see with Donald Trump's kind of a lot of the emperor's clothes are off in terms of US empire, then China will try to step in and become the responsible adult, quote unquote. And I think that will actually then impact
Mhm.
Taiwan, particularly if there's a lack of solder in the region and everyone starts moving towards China, that will put us in a very difficult position. Yeah.
Okay, from Patrick Poon, what's your impression of the attitude among young people in Taiwan with regard to China's threats, unforceable code reunification, and code in views of witnessing what happened to Hong Kong's dismantling civil society.
Yeah, thanks for attending, Patrick. It's good seeing you. So I think it's actually quite dangerous in the sense that there are people who have forgotten this or have become a kind of abstraction. Because the 2019 crackdowns, that's very recent. And then this continued assault on activists has increased. But then that was for people who are Gen Z uh, 7 years ago, 6, 7 years ago. And so they may not have a clear memory of it. Before the emergence of the Bluebird movement 2 years ago, there was this narrative that maybe young people don't feel the same way as millennials, that they've forgotten this kind of fear, actually. And I think it's not true. I think that basically the Bluebird movement, which became larger than any kind of other protest movement in the past decade since Sunflower, has shown differently, that people are still concerned about threats from China. But then I think there's also this forgetting of Hong Kong, and it's actually very dismaying. I've tried to criticize the Chinese government many times on what's failed to do for Hong Kong asylum seekers, for example, even as it has been used in the past as a tool to win elections by the DPP, saying that, look at Hong Kong, we can't become that, vote for you. And then you do nothing for the Hong Kongers that have come to Taiwan. So you're often very precarious means, such as taking speedboats, for example, to get over here, crossing through maritime restricted waters.
Okay, I think we're down to our last question. This one is from Ian Hansen. Great and informative talk. What kind of grassroots interest is there for diversifying bases of support for the more admirable and progressive aspects of contemporary Taiwan life, given the unreliable partner that the Trumpified US has become? That's first. What second is what Taiwan leaders fear suffering is what the US is imposing now on, say, Cuba and Venezuela. What are the prospects for solidarity between small countries pushed around by great powers? Can there be ideological reaching across the aisle on on this issue of small countries' right to be ideologically different from their nearby great power?
Yeah, so this is a great question. There's actually this great Taiwanese novel. It's quite famous. It's about this world in which Taiwanese and Cubans suddenly trade places, and then Cuba is suddenly in Taiwan, and all Taiwanese people are suddenly in Cuba. So I think there's this sense that when you do see, for example, the blockade or the targeting of Maduro, who, I don't admire these regimes to be honest either, but you can see what happens when a larger power attacks a smaller one. And in that sense, Cuba offers an example of what a blockade looks like, the kind of economic suffering people endure, though I don't think people in Taiwan necessarily pay a lot of attention to that. But then in Venezuela, there was immediate responses as well, because, for example, what if the US, the way the US did a decapitation strike where they kidnapped the political leader, what if China did that towards our president, for example? But in that sense, the question for solidarity is, I think, it's very hard to answer. I don't know in that sense. It does rely on people connecting and not states, because I think states will always be very questionable allies at the end of the day. And I think then what's dangerous, though, is the kind of discourse of multipolarism that existed. For example, back to the Venezuela example, is that as soon as it happened, there was conspiracies in Taiwan about what if the US and China had come to a deal that China says, you get Venezuela, you get Maduro, and you give us Lai, you give us and then China gets Taiwan. And that's fear of basically the two powers trading off Taiwan, but also of this new, perhaps multipolar world in which, for example, great powers are left to run amok over the countries nearby them. And obviously we're next to China and not the US. And so I don't know, but then that's what I fear.
Okay, I think this is going to be our last question. Then we'll just read some of the comments here. Uh, so this is from wait the chat is moving. So is Taiwan allowing natural gas or rare metal mining along the first island chain? Could Taiwan give chances of developing an autonomous unmanned ship or submarine for mining them or fisheries?
Yeah, I mean, no, because we don't have sovereignty over the first island chain. Those are all like other countries. Yeah, Taiwan really lacks resources like natural gas, and so we're very dependent on imports, which is also not great because that's environmentally destructive. The liquefied natural gas terminals are like not great for example, coral reefs. Um, yeah, I think probably not in terms of autonomous unmanned ships for mining. I mean, there's a lot of work on drone funding these days, but it's like military use and also civilian use. I mean, things for filming and that kind of thing, which, but not really mining.
Okay. we'll allow this one last question. So from Max Carey, how much pressure is there in Taiwanese civil society to support militarization?
So this is a great question, and it's very interesting because, for example, the DPP as a political party historically was very cautious of military because it is the KMT's authoritarian backer for all these decades. But then the Tsai administration, like the last president, she starts trying to change the image of the military because of, again, the rising China threats. They're doing all these PR things with the military. And then as for civil society, there's another very interesting trend, which is civil defense. Because yeah, we realize that in wartime there would be restrictions on civil liberty. So what do we do then? And the military is a formerly authoritarian institution, still incredibly bureaucratic. The leadership is people that are from the authoritarian period, as just like basically during the first DPP president, he feared a military coup. And so civil defense then is civilian groups practicing for wartime scenarios, which doesn't mean training with guns and arms or softball guns that could paint airsoft guns that could be made into guns, but practicing for first aid and what if your building blows up, or what kind of rubble can you hide behind, or what do you bring in your go bag when you and your family need to make a plan and get out. And that's also a way to actually call the military to account when you're doing your own research on this stuff. And then saying, well, what you're saying is not true, in fact. And it is, I think, generally an issue where so much of our source of information about what happens is only in the hands of the military. And so we need to make this much more open to civil society to have oversight. And it's interesting as well and strange because I think for progressive and left, talk about war is very antithetical. But if we don't come to understand how this is occurring, then the conservatives are going to do the talking for us. And so I often see an issue on the left is where their understanding of war is basically from the neocons. We just assume, well, they know what they're talking about. And so that can often not be true. So I think there's this kind of desire to then make it allow for more accountability through civil defense.
Mhm. Okay, I know that we are down to our last 3 minutes, but let me just allow me, please, to ask this one last question. I think this has to do with like relating to other uh, country situations as well. This is from Chovat Det Ditilak. In Thailand, conservative parties used anger and bad feelings towards Cambodia to stir up patriotism. This helped them with win votes in election. Looking at Taiwan, how will China's current military drills affect the upcoming election this November? How will the main parties, let's say KMT, DPP, and TPP, use this situation to get more votes?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question, but I think that the military drills don't actually have a huge impact because people don't really react. I think what is interesting and of note is that Chinese people react when there's something that's very visual, provides a sense of the future. For example, seeing all these images of Hong Kong in the midst of protest or the war in Ukraine, whereas these military drills are taking place so far from shore, though it is actually just in a stone's throw of Taiwan when it comes to geography, that we don't have a lot of images. And so people feel threats through domestic institutions. The KMT is perceived as the proxy of a sense of threat from China in elections. So the DPP will talk about the Chinese threat to win elections, as they always do. The KMT say that, well, look at these drills. Only we can maintain peace, and we need to come to an agreement with China sooner than later. And the TPP will echo the KMT's line. And so there's that. But I also feel that basically it's just another thing that people kind of have become very used to now. And so I don't think the drills will have a huge impact. It's another part of the landscape that just occurs twice a year, and unfortunately makes me very busy during that time.
Mhm. Okay. I know that some questions are still coming in. Here's what we're gonna do since we still have like just 1 minute left. We will be saving the chat and we'll send it to Brian so he can answer it. We will be providing actually his answers to our after event email. But in the meantime, I would like to thank everyone for attending. We as we end today's discussion, we would like to extend our appreciation to everyone who opened their doors for exchange and on different ideas. We must continue these conversations as we build a path to a united effort in peace building. And we want to say, sorry, we at World Beyond War continue to call governments to declare neutrality and turn away from war and militarism as means of resolving conflicts. Rather, recognize that peace and diplomacy is much more effective and that real security does not mean militarization. Thank you so much for attending, everyone. I know that especially if you're somewhere around the same time zone with us. It's your Friday night. You can have been in bars, clubs, or whatnot, but you have joined us in this important discussion. Uh, and of course, we want to invite everyone. We will be having more learning sessions in the future. As World Beyond War Asia continues different conversations and different discussions on country context so that we can somehow map out and look for the commonalities so that we can campaign as one region and continue our work for peace building. So please follow our work. You can visit our website, our Facebook, X, and other social media platforms. You just have to search World Beyond War, and you can send us an email for any collaborations at asia@worldbeyondwar.org or my direct email, j@worldbeyondwar.org. Again, thank you so much, Brian, for indulging us in this discussion. To everyone, please expect the after event email with the link to the recording and hopefully with the questions to some of the answers. Sorry, to some of the questions that was sent to our chat room. Thank you so much, everyone, and well, we want to say have a good weekend, have a good rest of the day for some, and have a good evening for some of the people who are here. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.